Today's episode is brought to you by Charles Russell Speechleys. Charles Russell Speechleys is an international law firm with a special focus on private capital at the intersection of personal, family and business interests. With origins dating back to the 1800s, the firm has a long-standing reputation for building strong, trusted relationships with their clients. These relationships are crafted to deliver meaningful value and, like Charles Russell Speechleys, are designed to stand the test of time. In a world that is constantly changing, the steadfast, long-term relationships that Charles Russell Speechleys builds with their clients remains a constant. To learn more about their services and how they can help you, please visit www.charlesrussellspeechleys.com. Hi, I'm Violet Manners and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans and experts. Today on Hidden Heritage, I'm joined by John Goodall, historian, author and editor for the architectural pages of Country Life for 16 years. John spent his childhood in Kenya, Germany, India and Yorkshire. He worked as a researcher and historian at English Heritage. He also then became a journalist and frequent contributor to Country Life magazine, where he's subsequently been for 16 years. He's a tremendously accomplished author, with many of his non-fiction works winning awards, including the Spears Award and G.T. Clark Prize. In today's episode, John explains when his passion for national heritage first began and his early beginnings as a writer. We talk about his time at Durham University, his important work with Country Life, and what real pleasures of British life actually are. John also recommends 3 of his favourite, in fact 4 of his favourite destinations in the UK. But before that, let's get to know John and hear about him in his own words. John, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve. It's a great pleasure.
So John, can we just start with an introduction in your own words of who you are and what it is that you do?
Well, as you've said, I'm the architecture editor of Country Life, which means that I'm responsible, amongst other things, for preparing the weekly pages usually on a country house, but on an architectural theme, and commissioning the photography for illustrating them. I've been doing the job now for 16 years, and for a weekly, it really does build up. I mean, Country Life, of course, is unique for being a weekly glossy, effectively, and it's enormously exciting because I get the opportunity to travel, to see so much, to meet such interesting people in the places I go to, and then to go away and to try and think through what I've just seen, which is quite a complicated thing sometimes. Besides that, I've always been, very interested in buildings, historic buildings, but also in Country Life, great pleasure of it is you're looking sometimes at a house that was finished yesterday, and sometimes one that has 1,000 years of history behind it. So seeing that enormous spectrum of material is enormously enjoyable and valuable. And
so you are known for your appetite and knowledge, enormous knowledge for...
Because I feel it's embarrassing. I don't know.
No, but it's incredible.
It just makes me think I managed to persuade people. I know things that I probably don't.
No,
there's so much to know about these things. And I have to say that whether or not I know a lot, I'm always conscious of my relative ignorance when I turn up to places and how much more there is to understand.
Yeah, I'd be fascinated to know how often you have been surprised by something maybe that you've learned, but we can almost kind of come to that. So how did you're known for obviously your amazing kind of appetite and knowledge of architecture and buildings, in the work that you've done as the editor for Country Life. But where did this passion first begin for you?
Well, I think it has 2 sources. The first thing is that I was very privileged to be educated partly in a castle in Yorkshire, a place called Gilling, and I was at prep school, and it has one of the greatest Elizabethan interiors in the country inside it, which was where we used to eat our meals, often in silence as a prep school boy. Yeah. And I was mesmerised by that interior. And then I went to university, as I'll be talking about in a moment, at Durham. And those 2 places really shaped my interests at one level. But also I was a diplomatic child and travelling around. And I suppose it's one of these odd things that when I was travelling, the world around me always seemed extraordinary and exotic. And then coming back and living in Britain again, it suddenly occurred to me that actually it's quite as remarkable and as exotic. But we just, because it's familiar, we tend to look through it. So in a way it was going away and coming back and seeing Britain as a remarkable place. It's always struck me, whether I'm walking on the streets of Barron, Furness, or, up in Scotland or in the West Country, it always comes across to me in a way as a sort of exotic and wonderful place, which I really believe it is.
No, I completely agree. And so, so your time spent as an expat, so you were an expat for a time as a child?
Living, sort of, yes, dividing my time between different places, yes, going to and fro, yes.
Wow. And so I guess you saw, what you're describing is that you saw England, the UK as a whole through that prism.
Through a different, maybe a slightly eccentric lens, but yes.
Amazing.
Indeed.
And then how did it then develop into being your career of choice?
Gosh, well, serendipitously, I don't know if we ever choose our careers, at least I'm not like one of these...
Or just trip and fall into it.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I was involved in writing country life articles. In fact, when I did my doctorate, I knew Giles Worsley, and he very kindly invited me. He didn't have any contributors for medieval subjects, which is what I was studying at the time.
And Giles was the previous editor.
He was the previous, indeed. He was the previous architectural editor.
Oh, sorry,
he encouraged me to do that. And I actually stumbled across some of my early correspondence with him and an early article I drafted for him, and it was excruciating to read and see his patient comments about how terrible it truly was, which it was.
Really? I can't believe it. I mean, I guess it's like anything that we put out into the world as a sort of as a first draft or a first stab at something. It's never quite as refined as you'd hope it to be. And then, so that then involved. So you were at Durham at the time, presumably, when you wrote that.
I was, by that time I'd come to do my doctorate at the Courtauld Institute in London, and then I went from there and I worked for English Heritage for a while as a historian. I was involved in relaunching a guidebook series for them, which was again a very interesting experience, because guidebooks, obviously they have to be beautiful publications, but they are specialist literature in the sense they're the only kind of literature that's written to be read in a particular place.
That's so true.
So it's
within the context of what you're writing about,
And I think that actually that again is such an exciting and important element of traveling around. You do need to see these places. You actually need to experience them, and being in the place is the oxygen that allows, gives me enthusiasm for what I do, and that's sort of so vital. And that guidebook experience was hugely valuable. And I had a wonderful boss there who was, again, incredibly patient and sort of brought me on. So that, in a way, was my way into country life. And as I say, I've done it now for 16, nearly 17 years. So it's
wow. Because you are so right. I mean, why is it so important that people do see these spaces for themselves in your mind?
I do quite enjoy libraries, but I also find them in a way quite boring as places to work. What I always find intoxicating is that with architecture, you have to travel to these places. That's an experience. You get to these places, they're shaped by the weather, the seasons, the people you meet there. It turns what could just be an abstract intellectual exercise into something incredibly visceral. That you go to these places and you really engage with them and you see them. And in the finest places, you are astonished, I think, by the quality and interest of what you find, whatever it is, whether it's historical or new, and the engagement of the people who live and care for these places, I think is, always revelatory. It explains why they are in the form they are, why you see them as you do. And that sense of care and love for a place. Because, after all, I suppose a country house, by definition, is really the architectural product of the intersection between a family or several families and a particular place. And
so true. That's a beautiful way of putting it.
And I feel that that's what you're exploring. You're going to that place and you're seeing, if it's privately owned, you're seeing that family, and you're seeing the place and what they've created, and it's still going on. So of course you have to see it. It's like a continuous chemical reaction. It's always happening. You have to be there to see it.
I absolutely love how you just described that. It's so beautifully put. So thank you. That's amazing. You said you studied medieval history specifically at Durham. What is it about just that period of history that fascinates you the most?
Well, I love being able to link places with people, and there is one of the great advantages of medieval history, particularly early medieval history, that there are a limited number of sources. That you can actually see your way around the material. As a way of learning about history, it's very useful knowing what the known unknowns are, knowing what being able to see round a problem, think about the documentary material, the physical evidence, and integrate them together. I think that's a very useful discipline. I wouldn't see myself just as a medievalist, but I do love that, and the fact you can link these things to fragmentary remains of buildings. I think also it cuts out a lot of noise. When you study things that have been done much more recently, it can be very difficult, I think, to see the wood for the trees, because there are so many ways in which you can get engaged with a subject. There's often so much material. It can be quite difficult to know what's really important or what to lay emphasis on.
Because they've been later interpreted or reinterpreted.
Well, just because, if you think about, if something happened in 1170, well, there might be a few chronicle accounts. There might conceivably be a pipe roll reference or something like that, and then there might be a building. Well, I mean, if you do something now, there'll be newspaper reports, there'll be WhatsApp messages, there'll be...
So true.
Do you see what I mean? That somehow the material...
The source, the kind of original source.
I mean, of course, it makes what we say about what happened in 1170 in some ways really simplistic, but then there's also a kind of honesty in saying, we don't know. Whereas with something later, we were always forced to acknowledge there are so many different perspectives on what that might mean and what our attitude and judgment might be. I enjoy both things now, but I felt as a sort of founding experience, I found that really enjoyable. And I did my doctorate on this place called, it's a small school and hospital that still function, founded in 1437 in Oxfordshire at a place called Ewelm. And it's an institution founded by the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, really interesting woman.
Who was she?
Well, the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, and she marries a man called William de la Pole, who's the Duke of Suffolk, who's a favourite of Henry VI. And they build an enormous palace at Ewelm, which is tragically lost, but the almshouse and school they found together, attached to the parish church, are still there. They still have, it's a primary school, and they're still almsmen in the cottages. But I found that fascinating, because you had the buildings, you had all the documentation, the accounts of the almshouse from the Middle Ages, you had the statutes, which are the rules by which people lived, and it's a little bit like reconstructing a play. You have the set. You have, in the statutes, you have the text, and you can try and reconstruct the performance, what happened there, what was going on. And as Leopold is clearly a really formidable and remarkable woman, and her tomb survives in the church, and it's a unique survival of the period, carved of alabaster, and it comprises her effigy as a duchess on top, and underneath an effigy in alabaster of her emaciated corpse, what's called a cadaver, underneath.
Wow.
And its eyes are carved slightly open. It's a life-size image, and it stares up in an act of perpetual devotion at paintings of John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, and the Annunciation. And you have there this extraordinary thing, a work of art staring in devotion at works of art that, as a viewer, you can't see. So
What do you mean?
Well, you would have to lie on the floor to see the paintings. The point is the paintings are being prayed to by her effigy that actually represents her. This is the work of art as almost an animate object.
I see. Was that a political statement?
You couldn't see it. It's a devotional statement. It's about her as a corrupted corpse, a dead sinner, staring at these figures who will intercede for her in heaven. It's a completely private exchange. It doesn't involve you or I as a viewer. It's going on all the time. It's going on right now. And it will be as long as the monument stands. It's a very amazing thing. And I mean, there are parallels in other parts of Europe of coffins with paintings inside them. But what's so remarkable about this is that it is, of course, a work of art, staring at a work of art in perpetual devotion. It's really extraordinary.
I've never seen anything like that.
It's worth going to see. Yeah. It's totally amazing.
I think that's probably, you're now going to squeeze in 4 recommendations instead of 3, but we'll just have to make that work. I'm delighted though to hear about that. I definitely want to go and see. Was that a very common practice?
No, she's clearly a very remarkable figure. But it shows again about how people I think we had overfed on this idea that the world changes in the Renaissance. The world is always changing. Change is happening all the time. But I mean, I think that we underestimate and we often parody the simplicity of medieval life. It's a much more complicated and interesting society than is often popularly given credit for. That's given credit for. And I think there's a huge amount about it that really is fascinating and engaging, and would be engaging to people if they only knew about it. But we're just not very good at the Middle Ages in Britain.
Yeah, why is that?
I think it's because we're obsessed by the idea that the world is reinvented by Henry VIII and the Tudors. And I mean, of course, it is in some ways, but in other ways, of course, Henry VIII is he's a very medieval king.
Yeah, this is true.
And so you get these paradoxes And also, I think a long-standing, British hostility to Catholicism. It means that a lot of
we kind of blot it out to some.
Yes, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's and whereas I think, let's say, I know the world is always sunnier in other places, but in France, I think people see their origins in the Middle Ages. That's where the cultural, the people run their cultural roots into the Middle Ages. And I think in Britain we do not, in an obvious way, though. As a matter of fact, our great cathedrals, are by a country mile the most worked and significant historic buildings that we possess, and they all have their roots in
medieval
or in the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, we sort of don't talk about it, but we acknowledge its significance.
That's such a good point. I hadn't really thought about that to the same degree, but I think that's a really fascinating point. But let's move on now to your first destination and recommendation. I imagine, given your sort of 16 years at Country Life and indeed at English Heritage before, this can't have been an easy task to sort of or distill into sort of 3 destinations that we're going to walk through. But I'd love to know your first one.
No, well, it's always a good discipline. And I thought, because the first section of this talk was about my background and everything, the first place I would choose is Durham, because it's where I was at university.
Yes.
I was fortunate enough to be in the college in the castle. And Durham is one of these places that brings together an enormous weight of history with a richness of architecture and buildings that is, almost, certainly in a European sense is significant. You have the cathedral, the monastic buildings, you have Palace Green, you have the castle, and you have the peninsula with all its buildings and houses, surrounded by these wooded walks on the banks of the River Wear. And it's very hard to think of another place that is so concentrated, so deep in history, and so rich, and that for me is somehow what a lot of the joy of British heritage is that when you go to places that there is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of history, and you always inevitably through your interests end up prioritizing one element over another. But in fact, I suppose the longer I do this, the more I find pleasure in every layer. I mean, right up to the present, because they're cumulative things. And I feel Durham is one of those places that whether you walk into the nave of the cathedral, which is surely one of the great architectural spaces of Europe, or you go into the chapel in the castle, or the great hall in the castle, which has been, used for nearly 1,000 years by the bishops of Durham, you cannot fail to be amazed and impressed by the depth of history, but the fact that it's all still functioning. That Castle is still a university college. People eat in that hall every day. The kitchens built by Bishop Fox in 1499 with graces carved over the shutters of the doors to it. They're still used to cook meals 3 times every day.
Really?
And I love that about British heritage. It's always changing. It's used. It's being enjoyed and loved, even if people don't notice. It is actually living.
Yeah. And for our listeners, where exactly is Durham, just for our listeners? And then but also if you were to pick one place in Durham that has the most resonance with you,
it would have to be the castle.
Because that's where
I spent so much time. But of course, so Durham is in the north of England and between York and Edinburgh, very roughly, if you look at a railway line just south of Newcastle, and surrounded by the most wonderful countryside, and it's a marvellous part of the world, real character. I love it.
And then the castle itself, what's the history of the castle that you spent so much time in? That's now a university.
That's now used. So the castle itself, it's begun very shortly after the conquest, probably by William the Conqueror after he's returning from Scotland, having punished the Scots, and it becomes the seat of the bishops of Durham, who enjoy a unique position in amongst the British peers, because they become what are called bishops palatine, which means that they exercise over this huge area of land royal rights, not the king. They exercise these rights, and so
which was sanctioned by William the Conqueror.
Well, it's more complicated than that, but it becomes effectively sanctioned by the king, and those Palatinate rights extend unbelievably until the Reform Act of 1832.
Gosh.
And they are actually based on this unique arrangement. The saint of Durham is a saint called St Cuthbert. And St Cuthbert's body was exhumed on various occasions in the Middle Ages and found to be uncorrupt. And his body enjoyed the unique legal privilege of being able to own property. So the bishops of Durham derived their landed estates through the ownership by the body of St Cuthbert of all the property that was associated with him. And in the 12th century, the people of the land owned by St Cuthbert are called the Havitha folk, the saints' people. And this becomes fossilized in the landholding system of the north of England. It's initially significant because it's the border between England and Scotland. That's what the function the bishopric of Durham is in a way serving. It's a secular as well as a religious function, but bound up with the body of this saint.
I see. And when you say St Cuthbert's body was undisturbed, I think
yes.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
Well, it means that there are these various occasions where people open the coffin of St Cuthbert, and his body is discovered to be uncorrupted.
Meaning intact.
Completely intact. And we even have this astonishing description of Henry VIII's commissioners who are coming. I think it's a man called Dr. Lee, who goes into the church and he tells his men to go up into the shrine of St Cuthbert and throw down the bones. And the man who's gone up has broken open the chest with a sledgehammer, and he looks in and he calls down, "I can't throw down the bones because I've broken the body is whole, and I've broken the saint's leg with my hammer," and is clearly very shocked. And the commissioners don't know quite what to do because they're going around smashing up shrines everywhere else, and everywhere else they're just getting rid of bones. And so they put it to one side and decide to come back and deal with it later. And who knows what happened? I mean, in fact, in the 19th century, the coffin of St Cuthbert was reopened with all these extraordinary treasures from the Anglo-Saxon period still in it by a man called Rain. And many of those objects are in the treasury in Durham, including St Cuthbert's pectoral cross, and they were indeed found with a skeleton. It's a fascinating story.
Is fascinating. So the castle definitely has to be your favourite, given all of that. That fascinating. I didn't know any of that, so I'm fascinating to hear more. Thank you, John, for sharing that with us. That's your first choice of 3 that we're going to be lucky enough to listen to today. But now let's just move on to the present and the work that you're doing now. For the last 125 years, Country Life has championed the pleasures of British life, encompassing, as you said, our architecture, our history, our landscapes, our gardens. It kind of is emblematic of everything that I think really makes this country so wonderfully unique. What for you are the pleasures of British life, if you were to summarise them?
Well, the 2 things that I think are the pleasures of it are, first of all, the weather and the seasons, which mean that although they're very unreliable, when you travel around, the world is always changing around you. You never know whether you're going to see something in snow or brilliant sunshine. So true. But I love the variety. I think I might find California with endless sunshine rather difficult to survive in. So that's one of the pleasures, is the sort of changing environment of it. But the other thing is that depth that I've already spoken about, that, even if it has happened before now, you're stranded in a remote railway station. If you walk out and you go into the town, you will find something really worth seeing, whether it's a house or whether it's a parish church or whether it's a marketplace. These things are that sense that there's always something there. And again, I'm not trying to be rude about America at all, because it's wonderful in other ways. But if you were stuck somewhere in the remote outback of America, you might really be somewhere where there was nothing to look at all.
So true.
And so, I mean, that's not why we go there, but it's a different experience, and I love that thing. It's very distinctively British. There's always something to enjoy.
So true, and also that is why so many people do come to this country, because of that kind of rich tapestry of centuries gone by that somehow, thank goodness, are still intact in large part across the country, north, south, east, west, that we can enjoy and sort of learn about and take in, even if you don't really know what it is that you're looking at half the time. But with thanks to sort of so many young people as well that are crazy. Alice Loxton, I don't know if you've come across that.
Indeed, yes.
She's on the podcast this week, but she was saying that actually it's all of the micro bits of content that she makes around things like bollards and the history of a bollard and the history of bollards in London in particular, those sort of famous sort of rounded and the history of them and where they come from. It's little snippets like that actually seemingly do the best, because invariably we walk past them every day, probably ignoring them a lot of the time, but it takes someone pointing them out to really resonate.
They have a story
They
too.
have everything in this country has a story of some description.
No, indeed.
Why, in your mind, John, is it important that we do pay attention to things, be it architecture specifically or otherwise, but why is it important that we pay attention to things in the past?
Culture and heritage have this really peculiar quality that when things seem safe and the world is in order as it was, I feel now, increasingly for much of my childhood and early adult life, it's easy to think, well, these things don't really matter, do they? I mean, they're not going anywhere. Who cares? But I mean, this very moment, there are people being killed for culture around the world. Culture in this curious way suddenly matters when things become really complicated. Culture, I think, tells you where you come from. I wonder often whether all our interest in culture is ultimately sparked initially by some sense of reflection, that you look at something, whether it's a bus or a train or whether it's a great house, and you see a glimpse of yourself in it, whether it's because you understand something about that building, or it relates to your family history in some way, or your grandfather was a train driver or whatever. And once you've seen that reflection, it seems to me you begin to become engaged by it, and you're likely to explore and find out more and more and more and more. So when we talk, for example, about the number of visitors to a place, or what you're actually doing is you're measuring the shadow of culture. It's not important in itself that number of people visited a place. What you're actually trying to measure is that this invisible thing called culture has drawn that many people to see it. Right. So all the time you fight at the disadvantage, in the sense that nobody can ever really quite describe what the thing is that's casting the shadow, and yet there are all kinds of metrics and ways of demonstrating that the shadow is there, that it's significant.
And also that it's ever increasing in some ways. I mean, I believe that, like everything, things go in cycles. And I think I've been saying for a little while now, like, I really believe our heritage is enjoying a renaissance, and that requires reflection on the sort of the greatness of our past and that which we are not so proud of. And those two being kind of looked at in tandem and reflected upon in tandem is important, because that shadow, I think, is ever increasing. And yet, to your point, what impact does visiting historical places, be it a cathedral, church, walking down the streets of London and appreciating the architecture, or indeed being in a historic house, what impact is that leaving? What imprint is that leaving on the person that's viewing it? And that's the thing that we haven't quite got around to measuring sort of in full just yet. I found it fascinating to see how shows like Bridgerton and others have kind of signaled to that shadow and why it's in a kind of nostalgic way. But if you measure the kind of currency of these places by the number of visitors that are increasingly going to them, one might assume that they're kind of going there with the same ambition to sort of be lifted, taken into another realm for a period of time, and allowed some form of escapism from this ever increasingly kind of busy, fast-paced, forward-looking world that we now live in.
Yes, and I also think we must never be too pious about what is real history and what is not. It seems to me all these things become of interest in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And Bridgerton is as acceptable a way into being interested in historic houses as, I don't know, a history degree.
Well, I mean, one takes a little less time to get through than the other, but I agree. But I definitely agree. As a huge figure and voice, which you very much are, because of the time that you spent writing about these places, and as you said in your introduction, modern and historic. What, to your mind, are the sort of challenges that historic buildings, spaces, churches, cathedrals have in the future?
Well, I think the problem always is ultimately money. Yeah. That brutally everything has to wash its face, and you need to make these things pay for themselves. Or the money has to come from somewhere. And I think striking that balance or working out how everything finds a financial equilibrium is always incredibly complicated. And, tax is one of the things that has ironically shaped heritage and what has survived and how it's managed today. And that, again, is really to do with this fundamental issue of money. I suppose that's one thing, how, and particularly at the present moment where so many institutions and individuals and the public at large are struggling often to make ends meet, that is, one massive problem. Another issue, it seems to me, is this whole business of people taking sides about heritage. I find myself very tired trying to trying to avoid being dragged into what people would call the culture wars. I don't think they're a constructive way of thinking about heritage at all. We don't need to pick sides with history. It comes with good and bad. We shouldn't be self-conscious, I think, about the bad any more than we should be sort of adulatory about the good. It seems to me we should look at these things in a balanced way, but we should celebrate them for what they do well and what they do for us today. So I think that's another thing that I'm very conscious of, is that there is a lot of pressure to take sides over buildings and somehow to defend their builders or to defend their architecture, it seems to me, or attack them. And I don't think either of those approaches is very helpful. It seems to me that everything is morally ambiguous, and you need to focus on what these things can do for us, not worry about what their history is.
I think that's a really valid point. Very simplistically, which, as I said to you before we started, is often how I look. That's my prism very often when I'm thinking about these places. But I think fundamentally we're in ever a kind of increasingly crowded world, and actually they are, in their own way, and by their very nature, in the sort of the way in which they are often situated in landscapes, they're beautiful spaces that allow for their additional and a beautiful spaces beyond your own home, beyond your own garden, beyond your own. And I think if it can just be even just simplistically looked at, look at these places through that prism, you can, there's something there for everyone, essentially.
They're beautiful, and we shouldn't be ashamed of saying that.
Yes. And so I'd be fascinated to know, John, because obviously post-World War II and during the Industrial Revolution, there was such an enormous amount of beautiful historic houses, 2,000 or so, I'm sure you'll be able to tell me the exact number or thereabouts, that were pulled down or lost. And likewise, lots of art and collections that went with them, and much, much else. What would, in your mind, be the kind of greatest loss?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, we've had sort of periods of devastation, and we had periods such as the Civil War, the Reformation, and obviously you could ask for some great church such as Glastonbury or Bury St Edmunds. I mean, wouldn't it be extraordinary to see a building of that quality and scale restored? But I was thinking about it in sort of more artistic terms. Henry VIII's palace at Nonsuch, which is by name the non-pareil of palaces, no other such. And this extraordinary palace built to incorporate monastic ruins. In fact, the remains of Merton Priory are poured into the foundations. But it is this prodigy building covered with stucco work and slate depictions of classical subjects, and it is clearly a completely extraordinary and unique building, which is demolished ultimately in the 17th century by Charles II's mistress, who sells the materials.
Really? Why did she do that?
Well, I think she just wanted the cash.
But back to money again.
Back to money. But its remains have been partially excavated, but it is clearly a building that of a coherently created building of one time, though it's augmented in the Elizabethan period and things, but it is clearly a prodigy building, and it would be absolutely extraordinary to be able to walk around it and see it and understand what that what the experience of a major palace in the 16th century was, but also one that was very unusual in its own terms and a prodigy, and deliberately so. Meaning
what? What does a prodigy mean by
meaning
listeners?
Something that's completely outstanding. I mean, calling your palace Nonsuch,
meaning absolutely zero.
No other such is there was nothing that looked anything like it, and we only have early drawings and engravings of it, and it's frustrating not to be able to know what it looked like.
Yeah, so that's one of the great losses. That really is a great loss. I'm actually going to look that up. I can't believe I sadly haven't. I've missed that somehow over the years. And now, John, I'd love to hear about your second recommendation.
So my second recommendation is, I feel these are all representative in a way, but a building I've just been working on earlier this year was Madresfield, which is towards the Welsh borders. It's in Worcestershire, I think. Yes, it is. And it's a fantastic house, a very deep history again, but its real interest is its transformation by the 7th Earl Beauchamp, who inherits it in about 1890, I think, as an 18-year-old. He's very interested in the arts and crafts movement, and he commissions a library. And the library is filled with, it's got beautiful bookcases carved by workmen from C.R. Ashby's group of workmen. He's an arts and crafts idealist. These absolutely beautiful shelves carved with imagery and inscriptions, and the shelves are full of beautiful books. But if you walk through the library, you come into the chapel that is his wedding present to his wife. And the chapel is covered in frescoes which have life-size images of the Earl and his new wife and his children, executed in, I think, from about 1910 onwards. The dates are hazy off the top of my head. But it's an absolutely astonishing arts and crafts interior. I mean, the two rooms side by side, they are unbelievable, and they sort of knock me sideways. But all this in a building that can trace its history right back to the Middle Ages.
Gosh.
And which has this extraordinary moment of the Ligon family who inherited. There's in the turn of the 18th century, there is a miser who fails to fill in his will. And his entire estate, which I think is estimated at millions, is then divided legally between three families. And this gentleman who's living, perfectly comfortable means with a large family, but is a modest figure, is suddenly enriched completely out of the blue by this absolutely vast sum of money.
I see.
But there's also a really interesting sort of subsidiary story to this, which, thinking about different aspects of heritage, is that he marries Lady Lettice Grosvenor. This is this arts and the 7th Earl again, who is the sister of the Duke of Westminster. But the Earl is gay, and he clearly has an interest in lavish parties and very interested in footmen and has lots of affairs and becomes increasingly careless. And the Duke of Westminster, in just the same way that happens to Oscar Wilde, eventually decides that he is going to persecute. He takes him to court and forces his sister to leave the house. They've obviously had a happy marriage up until this moment, and the entire family is split. He is eventually forced to go and live abroad, dies in exile, and all his children, who are painted in the chapel, they sort of side with him, rather touchingly.
Wow.
But it's a sort of fascinating story of someone who is very politically active and is basically disgraced and forced out this sort of dark underside to that heritage. And he's so angry. I don't know if it's him, but his wife's image is actually whitewashed out of the chapel, and it's been recovered now. And also her marble bust was found thrown into the moat.
No. How many years later?
Recovered.
Do you know?
Well, I don't know when it's rediscovered, but in the, it must be in the 60s or 70s.
Gosh.
And the family there are doing wonderful things. They've reorganized the house. It's completely fantastic.
And it's the same. So it's the same line.
Same family, which can trace its roots back, right back into the Middle Ages. And it's an amazing and beautiful place. And these two masterpieces in, the library and the chapel, they're worth going to see. I mean, they are extraordinary.
Wow. And so people can go and see.
I think so. I mean, probably by arrangement, but I mean, it's an absolutely wonderful place.
Gosh, I'm that's very much now on my list. So John, thank you so much for elaborating on your first two places of suggestions for our listeners. Soon we'll come on to your final destination, but we have very luckily just been able to slip in a fourth, which I think is sort of such a treat, frankly, for me as well as our listeners to sort of hear from you. But before that, let's just talk about the future, because I think as you've signaled to so much in our conversation already, these places are ever evolving, be it a church, a cathedral, a historic building. That's what I find so fascinating about our architecture and our history, is that actually it has very much moved with the times and to a great degree, and in many other ways, thank goodness, been very sort of much left untouched as well, which I think is that delicate and fine balance which somehow in this country we have managed to achieve. But are preserving historic sites and buildings crucial, do you think, to the future of a great and prosperous country?
Yes, well, I mean,
of
course they are, and in my view, and but we mustn't suffocate them by not allowing them to change. We mustn't kill them by coming to hate them as representatives of a past where we only see the bad side of the past, which of course it did definitely have, but it has positive sides too, and we must celebrate them. And I think that if we can allow them to change, and we can allow the past to celebrate what is positive about the past without forgetting its faults, our lives are enriched. And it would be cutting off our nose to spite our face not to cherish the things within them. And as you've said yourself, I mean, they are beautiful places, beautiful things, intriguing things. I mean, they are enriching of our lives. And why? And they give you different tastes and perspectives. History is important both because we recognise ourselves in the past up to a point, or can see things that inform our present in the past, but also because it comes to such shockingly different conclusions. And it's actually, I think, in the differences as much as the similarities, or possibly even more the differences, that we really learn from history. It's the fact that people really could regard things as totally and fundamentally different while still being human beings like ourselves is really significant. And that is so I think history, of course it's a foil for the present, and it allows us to see the present in different ways. And you could not be a thinking person and think that was not important.
I think sometimes in this day and age it's so easy for us to forget, because, and by virtue of the kind of the uprise to some degree of popular period dramas and beautifully kind of curated, manicured to some degree kind of versions of our history that are presented to us, it's almost sometimes, you could be forgiven for thinking these are just characters that we're referring to. Henry VIII could be a kind of fictional character but they were real, they were very real. As indeed were, the medieval kind of characters of their day. And I think that's what I find every time I go to a new historic place of any description. Ultimately, it's the people's stories that I gravitate to alongside the building itself and the collection. And if you're lucky enough to see all three things in one place, how amazing. But actually, it is the human stories that I always seem to find myself gravitating towards. And I guess, to your point, that's because I can see myself to some degree in one of their stories.
And I don't think you're alone in that.
No.
I mean, I'm capable of finding interest in things that are not human, but that's possibly the inhuman side of me, and the inner nerd. I mean, but I think that's what we do ultimately respond to.
We seek out. I mean, a question that I actually also really would love to get your opinion or thoughts on is, it's such an enormous part of our identity as a country. To be British is to, if you ask a sort of an international visitor or to the country, ask them to list the 5 things that for them are identifiable about our country. Invariably, one of them will be a building of some description. Buckingham Palace, probably the most obvious, or the Tower of London. But what is it about this country, to your mind, that makes our culture so sort of truly reflected in the buildings that we surround ourselves in and always have done?
Yeah, there are all kinds of answers that you could give to that, aren't there? And it's quite hard to know. I mean, one thing is because it's there. I mean, that you can't avoid it. You bump into it all the time. That, in fact, bound up with that, there are deep patterns of ownership and the distribution of wealth and things that do mean that these buildings still have agency in contemporary society, and that therefore they have a presence within it, and that people are conscious of it. I think it is also important to recognise that for some people, there has, historically as in the present, I mean, they represent all that's wrong in a way. But I mean, that again just makes the point that they do still have agency. They do have a presence, and they're perceived to represent something. So I think ultimately one answer to that question is simply indeed that they still have presence, and that means that we're conscious of them and that we engage with them, and we can't help but engage with them because they've shaped everything. And indeed, one of the reasons I love London, endlessly, you find that almost everything about London has been, it's such a deeply lived city. There's nothing here that's here by coincidence. I mean, you could say this of the country as a whole, that we're so intensively used. Nothing survives by accident. Everything that survives has to be looked after actively all the time. And London is this extraordinary place where those layers of history just keep being added. I mean, for all the destruction of huge areas of the city of London, the most aggressive developer can't quite get the stain of that history out of the streetscape, and thank God. But I mean, you do worry, but it's extraordinary how deep it is. You just, even in this place where money means that buildings are going up and down every 30 or 40 years, even so, the streets, the buildings, the churches between them, they're all still there, and they constrain it, and they flavour it, and they texture it. And, I think I'm right in saying that even the Shard is ultimately built where it is because a doodlebug landed there. It cleared space in the city, and that was redeveloped, and then after the war, and that was capable of being torn down. And so this sense of how one historical accident generates others, and it's history by the beat of a butterfly's wing and all the consequences of it. So, but that, I feel that that's being played out all the time in Britain, and that's why. And through, I suppose, also you have to say, particularly for a foreign audience, through the royal family, that culture is being reenacted all the time. And the coronation is this wonderful thing. It's the sort of, on one hand, it's deeply traditional and ancient. On the other hand, it's totally contemporary and constructive for the present moment. That paradox that history has a contemporary wing, which is, the present world is sort of reacting pragmatically to its history and using its history again as a foil to its own advantage.
So true. And I think things like the coronation really do signal to that marriage of the old and the new. And we could see that in the most recent coronation, and how it was sort of reinterpreted to some degree. To lots of varying degrees, actually, to reflect a modern...
Contemporary needs. And it's very conscious, the reinvention of tradition. It's happening all the time.
Yeah, it's so true. And I guess we've been particularly good as a country and our governments have been particularly good at safeguarding, our heritage and our historic buildings over time.
I don't know if our governments have been very good at it, but I think it happens. I mean,
What specific changes to government policy have been unhelpful or could indeed be enacted?
Well, I mean, it's tax, the removal of VAT from, the repairs to historic buildings. I mean, it would make the most enormous difference. This absurd situation that if you demolish a historic building and build a new building on the site, you don't pay VAT for the new build. But if you restored the historic building, you would pay VAT on it. For parish churches, the fact they have to reclaim their VAT, it means they still have to find the money. And for the inheritance of major properties, if you have high levels of tax on those properties, it means ultimately that things from within the collections have to be sold. So tax, it is over and over again, it's incredibly it sort of falls into this category of extremely important and it's astonishingly boring and technical. But it's absolutely vital. And if that is not managed and done with, thought, it can have catastrophic results. And
in the form of things being ultimately
broken up.
Yeah.
And I mean, nobody's, I suppose often with privately owned historic houses particularly, or with parish churches, which are effectively privately run historic buildings, nobody's exactly asking for charity for them. They need to run themselves properly. They need to wash their own face.
Absolutely.
But you mustn't create difficulties that make that almost impossible, because the results would instantaneously be disastrous. And there has not been, the subject of VAT has run and run and run and run and run for years and years, and no government has ever done anything about it.
It's an ongoing challenge. And one that does have, real impact.
Real impact in the field at every level. Because as we've talked about already, money, for all the other wonderful things you can talk about, money is the fundamental thing.
And I think that's what's so often perhaps misinterpreted or misunderstood about the frankly, any form of heritage, is that invariably so many of these places are incredibly asset rich, and that comes with its own challenges, the VAT and the tax being one of them. But ultimately, without them kind of staying intact to some degree, those collections or those buildings, and if tax were no longer an issue, it would mean that you would have some confidence in the future that these places will remain intact, and there really will be things for people to see in 100 years from now. And that's, as we've described in this conversation, is almost that sort of subliminal. It's difficult to exactly articulate why that is so important, but I mean, you've done the best job of them all explaining why it's incredibly important. But it would give so much confidence to think in 100 years from now, if there was things like the VAT thing being addressed, that these places would be intact. But I think there's often that dissonance that one can assume, looking up at a great building or indeed a great cathedral or church, they must be incredibly rich. And actually, none of these places are cash rich, but they are incredibly asset rich. And that's for the benefit of us all. And that's the message that I think is so important to get across a lot of the time.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to move very shortly on to your final destination. But if there was one sort of message, John, that you could share in your incredible sort of wisdom and time spent, looking and analysing and sharing your knowledge of these historic buildings and places with the Country Life readers and indeed all of us today on this podcast, what would it be, your message to sort of future generations in relation to preserving our history and heritage?
Well, I suppose it's it would just be the encouragement that the thing that is most important about these things is not what we say about them or anything like that. It's their survival, and that while they survive, they can speak to us. And we can all have different conversations with these buildings or these places or these works of art, however you want to, articulate that. But once they're gone forever. There is no replacement for them. And in that sense, I feel that the Campaign for Heritage bears all kinds of resemblances to debate at present about climate change and so forth. There is no planet B. Well, nor is there an alternative to this inheritance. If we lose it, once it's gone, it has gone forever. And I think that sense that it is the things themselves, it is those landscapes, it's those buildings themselves fundamentally that need to survive. I think there are all kinds of things that are immediately built into that survival. And one of them, although there are institutions such as the National Trust or English Heritage that can care for these properties, I think also that private ownership of these properties remains enormously important as a different story for the buildings that carry on being lived in, but they add a totally different dimension to the buildings themselves. And I think crucially, they add an integrity to change. I mean, one thing I notice about, again, this is not meant to be a criticism or having a go, but with a National Trust property or an institutionally owned property, you take it over and you look at it and you go and you find, let's say there's an Adam drawing room of the 18th century with lots of furniture that's been put in there at later dates. And you say, right, well, let's turn this back into an Adam room. And you get the Adam furniture back in of the 1770s and you redecorate it. Well, it's fascinating when you first walk into that room and you see it transformed from the way it had evolved into this room. But then where do you change it from there? 30 years down the road, and you can't justify taking out these things because you've turned it, you've sort of fossilized it. And how do you make that building seem fresh again? Well, it's a slightly unfair comparison, but if you have a family owning a house, well, they're living there. They can do things. Their decisions have integrity, not because they make architectural or aesthetic sense of a room, but because they're the people who live there. They can add to it. They can change it. They can adapt it. So it's not an entirely straightforward comparison and contrast, but it seems to me that having that private ownership as an element within the maintenance of our heritage and historic houses is crucially important.
Yeah, because it adds that character as well, doesn't it? That's really what it is. I think that's what I find. Again, if I just think about my own experience of visiting places beyond where I was lucky enough to grow up, but I think what I'm always so struck by when I go through the doors of an independent historic house, they can be of the same. They can be both buildings could have been designed by Adams and they could have both been built at similar times, let's say. But invariably, you can always guarantee when you walk through the door, the experience is going to be entirely different to the next. And that's what I value so much about that particular sector of heritage. And I enormously value the weight and experience of institutions like the National Trust and English Heritage, because invariably they've got some of the greatest specialists in the world looking after and maintaining and sustaining these places and these landscapes, which fell into their hands at different junctures through history. But I think I really agree. I think there's a very unique experience that can be found visiting any historic house in this country that still has a family in situ. So that brings us nicely on to your final recommendation of where you love and would suggest our listeners maybe explore.
Well, I'm pleased to say this is one place you have definitely heard of, which and I this is not just in deference to you, but it is Belvoir.
Really?
Because I thought it drew again as a sort of representative choice. It draws together all kinds of themes that I find so wonderful when you visit places. I mean, first of all, it commands its landscape. What an astonishing building. You can see it from every direction, and you're arriving at a great castle. It has an extraordinary depth of history, though the building you see today is largely a Regency creation, but extraordinary and opulent of its moment, with Duchess Elizabeth, throwing all the resources of the family at it.
Yeah.
It also has attached to it this familial history, which I think is so fascinating, as represented by all your family monuments in Madresfield Church. If you want to meet all the people who lived in Belvoir, and this is a very common and overlooked phenomenon, it seems to me, is you go to Madresfield Church and you see them all next door to each other in effigy. You meet the historic owners of Belvoir through time in the neighbouring parish church, and that's astonishing.
And why is that common, just for our listeners? Just explain.
Because in Britain, in England particularly, people who, they tend to be buried in the places where their family are significant. And of course, I mean, historically, when attending parish church services was a legal obligation for a period after the Reformation, you would have had this extraordinary situation where the family trooped in and the living family appeared in the parish church beside all their dead ancestors. I mean, that significance of ancestry as an attribute of political power, which I think to a modern sensibility is just bewildering. This idea that in order to exercise political power, you needed to have ancestry because people without ancestors didn't make the cut. I mean, it's totally foreign to our way of seeing the world. But of course, in these buildings, you see that being physically expressed, that everybody, all your ancestors are lined up behind you when you go to church. And what an extraordinary thing that is. So that's, in part, that link is important and to me is fascinating. I'm always going to parish churches to try and find, if you want to know who was responsible for this slightly strange early 18th century alteration of a country house in an English village, you can be almost certain that if you go to the parish church, you'll find the funerary monument and they'll tell you exactly who it was who cared about this place so much that, of course, they wanted to be buried there. That's why they made the alterations to it. So that link is really important. But also, of course, at Belvoir, you have this astonishing archive. And I remember when I wrote up the castle some years ago, there was the most wonderful, wonderful correspondence that I just absolutely loved reading through, from the tutor to the Duke, whose wife Elizabeth rebuilt the castle in the Regency, and he's the sort of archivist and chaplain to the Duke, and he's a man called Spark, I seem to remember, and he accompanies him as his tutor. And for those people who are literary fans, he's a kind of cross between Trollope's Mr. Slope and Jane Austen's Mr. Collins.
Really?
He's an absolute creep, clearly. And he writes this one-sided correspondence to the Duke all about the alterations to the castle and what's going on there. And
he was away.
Because the Duke was travelling around the country and around Europe and serving in Ireland, I think, in the volunteers and various things. And he has this chap on the ground, and he's always
keeping watch of Elizabeth.
He's keeping watch really of the building and the archives, and he's in search of really good church preferments. So the letters are laced with really interesting asides about the fact that some terribly valuable living has just come up and that somebody has offered so much money for it, but he knows it's worth more than that. I mean, he really is ghastly. And he writes a long letter of pious advice to the Duke when he comes of age at 18. I'm sure the Duke paid absolutely no attention to any of it at all. But you get this wonderful insight into the life of this place. He ends up, like lots of insufferable people, he does very well for himself. He becomes Bishop of Ely, and the mob attack the palace during the reform riots because he's clearly so awful. But anyway, that's all by the by. So
I did not know about Spark. I'm gonna go home and make sure I pull out
this is completely gripping in my view as a correspondence. But I mean, the archives are astonishing. There's so much. They're covering so many other buildings. But that, again, coming back to this, the human story. So at Belvoir, you get the landscape, you get the people, you get the parish church, you get the stories, and you get it all to symphonic effect when you walk around the building. I mean, what an incredible series of interiors as restored, everything from the Elizabeth Saloon to the great staircase and things. I mean, it is a symphonic building. And of course, like all the very greatest families, they have a historic house, Haddon Hall, down the way, which celebrates their ancestry. Basically, it becomes a museum house for a long period of time. And it shows that they're not just a new family, they're a very old one too. And that's like the Devonshires with Hardwick and Chatsworth. The Rutlands have Belvoir as their fashionable residence and Haddon, and that sort of. So I think Belvoir is a sort of extraordinary building, and of course, as you're part of it, you're very much alive, and it has so much to offer. It's such an engaging, fascinating, and impressive place.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, John. Mum and Dad would be thrilled to listen to that. But I think as well, for me, what I've always found fascinating, and I hope in the world of AI that we now live, I hope one day we can. There's a model, if you remember, of the Charles I castle in the ballroom that you can see when you walk around the castle, because Belvoir is the fourth castle on the same site, and as you've said, it was a Regency castle, completely rebuilt by by Elizabeth and John White, the architect, who was the same architect as Windsor Castle. And they share that kind of wonderful, I don't know what the technical term is, but round.
It's slightly different, but I know what you mean.
But
yes,
similar,
but James White, indeed, he oversees it with his brother earlier on.
Yes.
Yes. No, exactly.
But I hope, because I've only ever seen that sort of model of the Charles I castle, and actually I would love to see the two previous castles that were there before, and hopefully one day we can, because obviously there's drawings in the archives that I've seen.
And there's a copy of one of the paintings that was on the main staircase, I think, which is in the archive. I mean, we do know a lot about it, and because it's not obvious, it hasn't been very well studied.
No, it's true. Well, honestly, John, I could just sit here and talk to you for hours, and I'm so incredibly grateful for your time and
thank you for having
and also
me.
for your suggestions. And I also love that tip for our listeners of making a point to try and go and find the parish, the kind of the parish that was linked directly to the house. Because indeed, with lots of these houses, I think I'm right in saying they would have been attached to a number of parishes in their kind of local area, because invariably the Duke or back in the day, they would have been head of the parish kind of council.
Well, they often have, families tend to have burial churches. I mean, that there will be one, I mean, obviously
That's
like the Duke of
linked.
Rutland owns property from Yorkshire through to, everywhere. But this particular relationship with one church, the neighbouring church, is very, very common. And Bottisford is relatively far away from the castle. In most places, the manor houses historically sit beside parish churches for many historical reasons, and that relationship, if you go to Curzon's Kedleston, for example, the parish church with all the family is right beside this great 18th century house, and that's a much more common
setup. That's
arrangement.
Yeah, that's a wonderful tip, though, actually, for our listeners to sort of think about when they next go to visit a historic house.
Yes, you can meet the ancestors.
Yeah, exactly. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. And where can our listeners find you aside from your weekly article, which is probably the best place, I imagine? But are you on things like Twitter and?
I'm ashamed to say I'm not. But
okay, well, no. Frankly, we should all be taking following your lead on that front, because it's a much probably nicer thing to be able to just enjoy. Yeah, magazines as opposed to.
Yeah, I'm probably not. I don't know.
Oh,
I probably should be.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
What a great conversation with John. If you'd like to explore further the history, prestige, and pedigree, and the weight of the British national heritage, you can, of course, read all the more about it in the pages of Country Life, and read John's brilliant work that he's been so dedicated to for the last 16 years. So visit their website, www.countrylife.co.uk, or buy their weekly publication.